Okay. Okay, so we are now live. So I will start right now with my kind of opening remarks so that people have more time to join us. So hi everyone, I'm Céline PAJON. I hope that you had a very good summer, and welcome to the first webinar of La Rentrée, as we say in French. And so today we will reflect on the latest G7 summit that took place in Hiroshima last May. I think this is it was an important one because, in my view, it really showcased the kind of new international order in the making. As you saw, the Japanese host invited influential leaders of what we call the Global South, but that might be interesting to define that later on in the discussion. And we've seen also, he invited also key partners such as South Korea or Australia. The Ukrainian president was also present at the summit. And the discussion focused a lot on how to deal with revisionist powers such as Russia and China that are more and more assertive in challenging international law and governance structures. The world is indeed increasingly fragmented, power is shifting, and the system becomes multipolar. Competition is growing, countries prioritize their own interests, they tend to rely more and more on transactional relations, while the rise of transnational challenges such as climate change actually require greater cooperation. The UN-based multilateral system and key organizations such as the IMF and World Bank, as they exist today, because they reflect a Western dominance, are openly contested. And at the same time, we see a flurry of alternative formats, clubs and minilaterals that either support other model of governance, just think about the BRICS summit recently held, or that just try to make up for the lack of efficiency of traditional multilateral fora. So I would like to discuss all this development today through a set of questions. What are the characteristics of this emerging world order? How can the G7 navigate this new environment? Is this club, the G7, still relevant in the current context? And maybe the key questions, what is the future of the world governance and how to reform the global governance to maybe retrieve some legitimacy? I think Japan and Europe both demonstrate a key interest to uphold multilateralism and a rules-based order. So that's why I was particularly interested to hear Japanese and European experts on all this and learn about what kind of leadership and role Japan and European powers, and then France also, can play in such a context. And to do that, I'm very happy to welcome a stellar panel of experts and practitioners who will share their view. And I will now briefly present them according to the order in the program. I will start with Bertrand BADIE. He may not need to be introduced really because he is very well known, but is one of the leading French scholars on international relations. I used to study international relations with Bertrand BADIE's book, and is now Professor Emeritus at the Sciences Po CERI. He wrote numerous articles and books, and he has one volume coming up in October that offers a subjective approach of international relations in French. Unfortunately, maybe later on it will be translated. So in this webinar, Bertrand BADIE will set the scene and focus on the fluidity of international relations and the implication for the world order and governance. Then I have the pleasure to welcome Kiichi FUJIWARA, who might be presented at the Japanese Bertrand BADIE, or Bertrand BADIE might be presented at the at the French FUJIWARA, as you prefer. He is also a leading expert on international relations and professor emeritus at the University of Tokyo. He is a visiting professor at Institute of Future Initiative, also at Todai. And he will offer a Japanese perspective on the global geopolitical dynamics and global governance and Japan's role in it. Last but not least, I am delighted to have Reinhold BRENDER with us for this debate. He will share his views as a practitioner of international relations. He has an extensive experience in EU diplomacy. He actually just retired, and his last posting was as head of the European External Action Service Division in charge of the relation with Japan, the two Koreas, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific states. And Reinhold BRENDER will provide an EU or European perspective on the fragmented world order and governance and Europe's role in it. So this said, I'm just reminding all of you the rule of the game. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes for his initial remarks. And then I will let you react to each other's presentations, and I will raise some comment and question and open the Q&A to the audience. And so before we start, let me remind you that this is a public live streamed and recorded webinar. And to the audience, you are encouraged to write down your questions to our panelists in the Zoom Q&A window. And please do not wait until the last minute to do that, because the time will run very, very quickly. So I talk too much. So without further ado, let's start the core of the discussion with Professor BADIE. Thank you very much for being with us today. You can set the scene and start with your remarks. We're looking forward to it. Professor BADIE, can you unmute?
Yeah, sure. Excellent. Thank you very much, Céline, and I'm very happy to participate in this round table and to have this contact with my Japanese colleague and also my Japanese colleagues, because I expect that some people from Japan are also following us thanks to the internet connection. May I precise that I published a book that I directly wrote in English for the Anglophone audience and readers. And this book was published 2 years ago at Elgar Publisher. The title is Rethinking International Relations. It's not an advertising, but it's only for giving maybe some extra resources to all the people who are following this very short presentation. I hope that it will be very short. For giving you an idea, I will say that I wanted to entitle this presentation The Old West and the New Rest. What is the real meaning of that? That I want to stress two main factors which are currently endangering the international cooperation. The first factor would be what I would call the relative blindness of the old world to the world change. And the second factor is in major part because of globalization, a differentiation of meanings given to this new world. We are now in a world which is dominated by what I would call the politics of meaning. And the real problem which is at stake by now is that these meanings are different, are competitive, and are often conflictual. That's to say, when you kindly mention my next book on a subjective approach to international relations, I want to stress this conflict of meanings on what does international relations, what does international scene, what does international arena mean in our present world. And the meaning is not the same. And this conflictual meaning is something quite new, because we are coming from a traditional international system which was called the Westphalian system, in which there was an homogeneous culture of international relations. And now this homogeneous culture of international relations is over. And this is particularly grave and important because the change is very abrupt. It is abrupt as it is coming after several centuries of stable vision of international relations. We can say that up to 1989, and if we start at the 17th century, that's to say the time of the Westphalian peace, the world order has not really changed. Now it has completely changed, and essentially for three reasons: because it has getting inclusive. While the international system was essentially centered on Europe and is now global, this is quite new, is plural, as I mentioned, and is fluid. That's to say, not really structured, fragmented, scattered, of course, but I would say also permanently changing. And the other problem is that our present international system is based on a kind of dialectic of resilience and proactive reconstruction. Resilience is coming from the old world, and this proactive reconstruction is coming from everywhere in the world, especially from Global South. And Céline, you mentioned that it's very difficult to define Global South. That is quite true. But one possible definition is that Global South is gathering all the countries which are looking for a total reconstruction of the international order. This is a common denominator between China and the Central African Republic, while these two countries are quite different and totally different, of course. And in this process, G7 appears as a symbol of this resilience that I mentioned. You remember that G7 was created in 1975 at the initiative of French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and G7 reflects several aspects of this resilience of the old world. First, because G7 is centered on the North. Second, because it is one of the fruits of bipolarity. G7 was shaped by bipolarity. Keep in mind that G7 was first a club gathering all the main Western members of the bipolar world. And it was a way of consultation and of solving the problems that Western camp faced at this time: crisis of dollar, but also Vietnam War, and also the Watergate crisis. You remember that. And may I suggest to my Japanese friend and colleague that at this time, Japan appeared as an extreme West country, as the Earth, as you know, is round. more than a Far East country. And it was a very interesting reconstruction of geopolitics. The third point is that G7 was clearly embedded in the traditional vision of international relations, which was made of balance of power. And at this time, and it's one of the elements of the credo of G7, power was really the key concept of international relations. While now power is in crisis. Power is no more powerful. Power was defeated everywhere around the world. Was defeated in Vietnam, was defeated in Iraq, was defeated in Afghanistan at the time of the Soviet invasion, but also defeated in Afghanistan 2 years ago, as you remember. And that is a very important point, how to solve, how to overcome this crisis of power. Can you imagine that everywhere power was defeated during these previous decades? Briefly, in short terms, I would say that, in short words, sorry, I would say that G7 is the right expression of the word of hopes, that's to say the word of gladiators. G7 was the club of the main Western gladiators. What is the status of gladiators? And I have in mind the famous book of Quincy Wright, the great American political scientist, when he said that war is a competition between similar states. The problem is that now war is no more a competition, a challenge among similar states, but between asymmetric states. This word is probably now outdated. It is outdated for 3 reasons. First, decolonization. And decolonization has triggered a new politics, which would be called weakness politics instead of power politics. That's to say, decolonization was a very important moment of our IR history, as it consecrated the capacity of weakness in international relations. The second rupture is depolarization, 1989. Because depolarization put an end to pole as a concept. And personally, I would challenge the concept of multipolar world, because I think that we are, as Ernest Haas stressed, in an apolar world. That's to say, there is no pole, no faculty of attraction. This is something very new. But with the end of pole and polarization, it is also the end of blocks, of camps, of institutional alliances. We are now moving to another world which is no more made of institutional alliances, but of what I would call, if you permit, a free union world. That's to say, a world in which coalition, connivances are changing when facing new opportunities and new contexts. And among the best examples of this transformation, I would quote Saudi Arabia, but also Turkey, Iran, and so many other countries, or India, when the Foreign Minister, Jaishankar Subramanian, mentioned multi-alignment rather than non-alignment. And the third rupture is, of course, globalization, because globalization is promoting interdependence instead of sovereignty. And this is a real breakdown of the traditional international order, and I would say even of international law. In this new interdependent world, the zero-sum game doesn't play. And global issues, global securities are getting more important than competing securities and competing issues. And we are then moving to a world in which social issues are much more important than strategic issues, and in which hegemony is substituted by something very mysterious, which I would provisionally call post-hegemony. I would put an end to my presentation by defining 4 axes of this post-bipolar world, 4 axes which are really uncertain in our present world. First, it's global governance, as you mentioned. But this global governance doesn't work because national interest is still the key concept of international relations in the Westphalian grammar. And even we are getting in a very remote position facing global governance with the promotion of minilateralism. Minilateralism is exactly the opposite of global governance. Global governance is also challenged by what I would call politics of exclusion, which is another phase of minilateralism, politics of fragmentation that I mentioned. The second axe is fluidity. That's to say, except NATO, all the countries around the world are now abandoning the traditional, perennial, structural, institutional alliances for very short segments of connivance. That's why geopolitics is dead. This is probably one of the main features of our present world. We are in a world which is so fluid that geopolitics is getting meaningless and meaningless. The third axe is new conflict. As Mary Calder stressed, the old war is now more and more abundant. And when Vladimir Putin tried to reuse the traditional war, he was clearly defeated. He was clearly defeated. The new conflict, which is now at stake, is much more rooted into the social structures, is connected to social failures, to social crises, as it is demonstrated by conflicts like Sahel, Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, Congo, and so on. And the last axis is, as I mentioned in my introduction, we are now moving to a new world in which meaning is much more important than strategy. That's to say, before imagining the strategy of the other, we have first of all to understand what does the partner mean? What does peace and war mean in Africa, in China, in Europe, in America and so on. What does nation means in Africa or in Middle East? What does borderlines mean in Africa or in Asia and so on? We have to reconstruct an international relation grammar which would include this plurality of meanings and which will help to define the new ways for playing international relations in a plural world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor BADIE, for the extremely comprehensive presentation. We have a lot of food for thought and a lot to discuss in the upcoming discussion. And just to reflect on some of the elements that you pointed and some of the questions that are emerging in my mind, and I would like to raise them to you now, so that you can try to start to think about it for the discussion part. What do you make of the nuclear, atomic capacity, nuclear weapon? Because of course the international relations is really the definition of what is power is changing, but still we have this deadly weapon, which is the nuclear weapon, and played a very significant role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how we can react to that. So what do you make of it? And I will later on ask you to maybe to reflect on the President Macron's speech to the ambassadors just delivered yesterday to all the French ambassadors in the world, a very important annual speech in which the question of the crisis of global governance was really a key, and he called for reform, deep reform of the global governance, and highlighted some way to do that. So if you had the time to to listen to it, I would be very happy to get your views on it. With that, I would like to now pass the mic to Professor Fujiwara, who will give his own perspective, and of course you are also welcome to reflect and to react to what Professor BADIE said. But I'm looking forward to your insight.
Thank you, Céline, and many thanks for inviting me to this wonderful panel. I very much look forward to the discussion. I already have been provoked in many ways by Professor BADIE. It's an extremely comprehensive view. Over this past summer, I was brushing up my my book titled tentatively "The Collapsing World." Actually, it's not about a major world war about to take place, but the significant changes, transformation, and fragmentation of the world after the end of the Cold War, more or less. I never was a fan of the post-Cold War liberal order concept, because it really was much of an exaggeration. But nonetheless, we see very little of that. Just look back in history, think about 1989 to 1992, the end of the Cold War period, and you would see that China was supposed to be following Western world, if only because they want to maintain communist dictatorship. They would have to open up their economy, and there was this wishful thinking that if China is integrated to the world market, then political institutions in China would change in a manner that would be far more open than before. But when it comes to Russia, there was an exaggerated wishful thinking that the only path Russia can choose after the fall of the communist regime would be to accept liberal political order and also a free market economy. So the idea was that the Chinese and the Russians are going to follow the West anyway. And it really pains me to think, it gives me, hurts me to think that the basic foe in the post-Cold War order was not China, Russia, or the Islamic world, but Japan. Simply because Japan was a major economy then, which did not look like sharing principles that were adopted in American or European economies. So there was much discussion about the coming war with Japan. It's a different world we face right now. We take a look at the G7 summit, and you can of course see that two major actors in international relations are not there, and that of course is China and Russia. Russia, for the obvious reason being that that after the annexation of Crimea, the aggression toward Ukraine in two parts, and especially with the recent aggression toward Ukraine, there was really no way that Russia could be taken as a like-minded nation. I dislike this word, and I will come back to this word, but Russia was most certainly not, quote, a like-minded nation. When it comes to the China scare, it really was intense since 2010s, but became even more pronounced, not only between US and China or Japan and China, but also the European Union and China. The scare came not only from a rising economy, but on rising geopolitical, excuse my language, military fear. So China, Russia are not there. What's the use of a summit that does not include China or Russia? Well, the argument would be that there is an opportunity for bringing, again, like-minded nations together. And Japan did play a pivotal role, because Japan is not exactly a Western nation. It may have accepted Western political institutions and economic institutions, but traditionally and geographically, Japan is not part of the European civilization as it is. It was like that from the very beginning. The reason why Japan was invited in the summit meetings in the 1970s was simply because there was a strong presence of European nations, be it UK or France or West Germany at the time, that the United States needed a partner who would share and follow American voices. So essentially, Japan was included in the summit meeting because Japan would say exactly the same thing as the United States. And also Japan was a major economy, so you could not really exclude Japan from the talks. If you follow this line of argument, that major international bodies should include actors, rising actors, then most certainly China must be a member of the G7 meetings. And that is, in a way, why G20 played a major role after the world financial crisis. It was a body that included more nations than the European or American powers, and there was much expectation about G20 being a major format. It didn't work out that way. A larger number of nations also means a larger number of nations can, well, essentially work as veto powers. And the G20 did not really occupy an institutional ground as it was expected. Now let's turn our eyes to what happened in Hiroshima this year. Prime Minister Kishida was a very happy man. He was Prime Minister when Japan was the host nation of the G7 summit, and the summit could be held in Hiroshima, which is where he was elected from. Kishida from Hiroshima. And it was a major opportunity for Japan to play a role. Now, what role did it play? It reflects Japan's unique position in security matters. On the one hand, Japan, of course, is an ally of the United States and has been cultivating stronger military cooperation with Australia, and very possibly on ROK in the future. But nonetheless, Japan is, well, essentially part of the geopolitical West, if I may. At the same time, Japan is a major economy and has been more active in promoting liberal trade regimes for a freer trade than, for example, the United States. Just take a look at the sad fate of TPP, and you can see how Japan wanted a liberal trade order to be intact. It didn't really work that way. So for Japan, this was an opportunity to speak out. There was yet another issue, and that relates to what Céline pointed out, and that's about nuclear weapons. Now, on nuclear weapons, Japan is in a paradoxical position. On the one hand, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there is an almost bipartisan, nationwide denial of nuclear weapons on Earth. So Japan has been active in movement to rule out nuclear weapons from the Earth. But on the other hand, Japan is, well, part of the an ally of the United States, and for that matter, Japan is very much dependent on nuclear deterrence. And that somehow paradoxical nature showed up in the G7 summit this year. On the one hand, Prime Minister Kishida promoted the Hiroshima Vision that was included for the first time in the G7 summit statement. This is the first summit that has a statement about nuclear weapons and agreeing on abolishment of nuclear weapons in the future. But on the other hand, although there's much discussion about Russian blackmailing or possible use of nuclear weapons, there was also this rather realistic understanding that for the time being, nuclear weapons is necessary to pin down Russian aggression and possibly China. And that there we are leading to yet another issue. How can we work on a common policy toward the PRC? The discussion goes in several directions. One, of course, there's a difference of political regimes, governance. Certainly, it's not a democracy. And the autocratic nature of the communist regime has become even more intense recently. There is a China scare, not only in Japan, but also in the United States, and possibly extending to the European powers. But at the same time, China is a major market. And neglecting China or confronting China would be a very difficult and sensitive thing to do in terms of foreign policy. The word the G Summit chose was de-risking, avoiding risks. In other words, this is not decoupling. We're not cutting ties with China. But nonetheless, we are aware of possible risks that may grow out of the conflict right now. It didn't really mean much because it all depends on what action Beijing would follow. And also it did not include much substance because there is a division between the European Union nations and the United States or Japan for that matter. And to be very blunt, if there is a fear of Russia in Europe, there's a fear of China in East Asia. And if Europeans talk about the war in Ukraine, in East Asia, there would be discussion about a possible annexation or possible use of force by the PRC to Taiwan. You say Ukraine, we say Taiwan. I don't see much point in discussing this, and I personally do not think PRC is about to start a war and use of force for Taiwan, but there is a war scare going on. The G7 summit worked on yet another level, not as G7, but as a meeting of nations that are not exactly G7 members. The first one would be Quad, one that includes Australia, India, the United States, and Japan. And Quad had a summit meeting during this G7 summit. This is important because Quad is developing into an institutional framework as it is. We see Quad developing into environmental protection, debt control, satellite data. Is no longer a simple geopolitical scary ally, as we talked about. The reason why it had to be like that was because India is part of it, and India would never be part of an military alliance. And the way to get India involved was to work on institutions that may agree with Indian national interests. I do not think this is an institutional structure that would last because the framework is far from one that accompany legal sanctions. It is expanding in many ways, but the original idea that this is one to, well, somehow control China from the outside. It's still very much there, and that's why China has been very active in its criticism toward the Quad summit. South Korea is also mending fences in at the moment. I don't think the South Korean public is willing to accept Tokyo's advances or strengthening of government-to-government relations. But this is a welcome sign for the United States because, to be very blunt, the United States faces two fronts: one China and the other Russia. And the United States alone cannot confront two major powers on two fronts simultaneously. So the only way is to strengthen alliance network. And to strengthen the alliance network, the obvious choice was to work on a more multilateral alliance network in East Asia. In Europe, you have NATO, but in Asia, there's no multilateral alliance network to speak of. Therefore, strengthening ties between Australia and Japan and South Korea and Japan was essential. So this is the scary part. And yet another dimension is quoting the Global South. The Global South means many things. But we may think that this is a moment, in a way like the end of the Vietnam War, where major developing nations are asserting their voices much more actively than before. If in the 1970s there was call for a new international economic order, right now there is this discussion about the Global South, where both China and Russia are quoting support from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or Brazil or South Africa. And what G7 did in the Hiroshima meeting was to invite as many Global South members as possible to show that this is a meeting of like-minded nations, but not only limited to a major economy. I don't think this would last, really. India is enjoying this moment where every nation wants India to be a partner, China or the United States, but they're not making any firm commitments at this moment. They want to maintain ties with Russia, China, or the United States and Japan simultaneously, and that alone leads to a more transactional nature of this meeting. I should end here, been speaking too much, but the G7 Hiroshima Summit, as usual with summits, came out with a huge number of papers, but we have to be very careful whether it would leave a legacy, an institutional framework that we can rely on. Frankly speaking, I do not think we can see an emergence of an institutional structure that allows for more predictability at this moment. And Kishida may be a happy prime minister after the summit, but what it left to the future is highly dubious. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fujiwara Sensei. Very interesting to hear your view from Japan. I can spot some difference with what Bertrand BADIE has said, and I see also a question from the audience that is looking at what we define as power, and traditional art power is actually quite still very important and back in the game with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course the arms race that we see in the whole world. So we can discuss all this maybe later on, but it was interesting to get this alternative views, and I will be back also with the question from the audience, because they are very interesting. But now I will give the floor to Reinhold BRENDER. So thank you very much for being with us and being so patient to speak. This is your time, and you can. I wonder if you see and how you see the trend described by our expert here. How you experienced them as a EU diplomat, and how do you see things are going right now? Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Céline, to you, for Céline PAJON, for hosting this event, and for Ifri for organizing this and setting this up. And I was, of course, not at all bored when I was listening to the distinguished professors, because I think what they said is very important. And let me come back to some of the points they made in my brief presentation. Now, you know, I have had 3 times I have had a look at the title of, of this event. You know, you asked us to talk about what type of Japanese and European leadership in a fragmented world against the background of the Hiroshima Summit. So I understand this to mean that we are tasked to look at the world as it looks, as it is today, and what does this mean for Europe and Japan in trying to lead the world. Now, the question I have, of course, is what does lead mean? To what direction do we want to go? We are immediately in, there are a number of important questions out, but I think the starting point is really to look at the current situation. And there were important elements mentioned, and let me just come back to 3 points. I want to make 3 points on the current situation, and then going forward, I want to give a look ahead also to the way forward. Now, it has been said, and I can only confirm, it would be very surprising if I would say anything else. The world has become much more fragmented. There is not a strong multilateral system, certainly not, and that is a problem. And I hear now the French president refer to this, and I think that's a fundamentally important observation. The world has changed, and Professor BADIE has very clearly set out in this context, for example, the G7's changing role. Now, the world has become more fragmented, and we have seen this, for example, also in the reaction to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's well known that the General Assembly votes have shown that there is unity of the West, but we have not managed as the West, and it was said that the West, the world so far has been essentially directed by the West. We have not managed as the West, if I may say, to isolate Russia diplomatically. Yeah? 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that have not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is a fact. And non-Western countries have become more assertive in their dealings with the West as their political and economic influence grows. Let me briefly refer also to a finding of a survey of the European Council on Foreign Relations, the NGO. They carried out an international survey looking at the world's reactions to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they come out with a number of key findings. The first is, indeed, it is true, we can speak of a consolidation of the West in reaction to what has happened, but also most people believe, and that's very important, that the US-led liberal order is declining. So this is a widespread perception, both in the Western world, but also in the developing world. And interestingly, in the United States and Europe, the predominant view is that there will be a new bipolarity where the United States and China will be the primary centers of power, whereas outside the Western world, many anticipate there will be a fragmentation in numerous poles. So against this background of indeed what can be described fragmentation of today's world, multipolarity or apolarity, bipolarity, or many new poles, we have to discuss this further. Against this backdrop, the world faces a fundamental dilemma, and that has to be clearly spelled out. We need dramatically increased international cooperation today on a broad range of issues of global concern, while we face fragmentation. And that is a key finding, and which is not reassuring. So we are in a situation where we have to take action collectively as the world, because issues such as climate change cannot be addressed without us as the world getting our act together. And we are not there where we have to be. And let me also say that the United Nations Secretary General Guterres in Davos at the World Economic Forum in January, the topic of the World Economic Forum meeting was cooperation in a fragmented world. And Guterres gave a speech where he said, from his perspective, we were looking into the eye of a Category 5 hurricane, he was saying, given that we have these problems and we do not have the level of cooperation we need. And he identified a number of issues where this is obvious. He referred to climate change. He was basically saying, literally, he said the objective of the limiting climate in temperature rise to 1.5% risks going up in smoke, he said. But he also referred to other issues, in particular the economic situation, which requires collective action. And he referred notably also to the issue of the confrontation between which is emerging or seen by some between the United States and China, but also the South-North divide. So a number of issues on which cooperation is needed and where it does not take place. And this is a second finding. A third finding concerning the current situation is, indeed, we have a situation where the global South is taking position more vocally. That has been said before, and I agree entirely. Indeed, the global South means probably many things to many people, but essentially, it has also been indicated the global South predominantly represents still rather the poorer world, with some exceptions. And essentially, it is a world which seeks to change the current international arrangements. There is unhappiness about the US-led world, the Western-dominated world, and from the perspective of the global South, this should change. And the latest development concerning the BRICS, the invitation issued to 6 countries, makes clear that indeed the BRICS, such as other bodies, are in a situation where they try to make use of this widespread unhappiness to strengthen their own ranks and thereby to gain momentum and more power in taking up their issues. Now, Indeed, Professor Fujiwara was entirely right in my view to point to the importance of inviting leaders from the global South to the Hiroshima Summit. There were indeed, there was a deliberate effort of Japan to reach out to them, to make them understand, these countries, that their voice is heard and they are understood, at least as far as it is possible within the limits of what the G7 can do. And so there were indeed a number of high-level leaders invited to the G7. It was India as...
Oh, Reinhold, you're muted.
Sorry, I touched the button accidentally. Sorry. So I was saying Professor Fujiwara was rightly stressing the importance of the invitation to Global South representatives to the Hiroshima G7 summit. We had India as the chair of the G20, Brazil as chair of next year's G20, the Comores as the chair of the African Union, Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN, the Cook Islands as the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, and others. So there was a good representation. And also, if you look at the summit statement, which was very long, as you will have seen, a lot of it covers issues which are of direct interest to the Global South, issues such as climate change, development finance, and other issues. So I think, and this has a little bit been under the radar, I would say, and overshadowed by the issues of China and Ukraine, Global South issues were prominent ultimately at the Hiroshima Summit as well, as was originally also had been foreseen by the Japanese presidency. Now, I wanted to mention also going forward, still under the heading key findings and under the aspect of the importance of the Global South trying to become more vocal, that India, as the current chair of the G20 at the upcoming summit in September, I think it's 9th and 10th of September in New Delhi, has also clearly expressed the intention to make the voice, the Global South, heard. That is something they have in mind. They want to position themselves as speaking on behalf of the Global South, and where exactly this will lead, we will have to see. Now, these are three key findings which I have presented. Some of this has been said before: the fragmentation on the one hand, then the dilemma of absence of cooperation while we do have fragmentation, and the increasing efforts of Global South countries to become more vocal and make their voice heard. Now, going forward, where does this leave us? Where do we go from where we stand, and what is the role of Japan and the EU in this context? Again, the background of the questions we were asked. Now, I was a little bit surprised that Professor BADIE, you left us a little bit in the desert, I would say, because you set out, in my view, very convincingly the current situation, but I think we need also to try to identify what the options are going forward. And I'm sure you have a lot to say also in this respect in the discussion. I would be very interested, against your very compelling presentation of the current situation, how you see steps to us collectively as representatives of this world to be able to take collective action. You were understood quite critical of global governance. I think you were rather not convinced that it would be able to operate properly. You said global governance does not work, if I understood you correctly. Perhaps you can elaborate on this. Perhaps you see a chance to make it work. Now, from my perspective, let me set out a couple of points very briefly, 6 points, in fact. I will be very brief. So looking ahead, what does it mean? Where do we go? What does it mean for the EU and Japan? First point, it is true, the G7 cannot run the world, but it will remain an important player, no doubt. I believe also other bodies will also play an increasingly important role, the BRICS amongst others, but also the G20 we have to see. So we have to take the broad view and look at the whole range of institutions that are out. The second point I want to make is that that the EU, of course, and this is in the genes of the EU, wants to make multilateralism work. That is our interest. We want to see multilateralism being effective. And So we have to identify options for us to do this. And one starting point is clearly to try to find partners for this effort. And I believe Japan is a natural partner for efforts to revive multilateralism. And this commitment to multilateralism is, of course, grounded in the conviction that the international community needs an effective multilateral system based on universal values and rules to respond to global challenges, such as climate change. Now, third point, there is no hiding. We cannot manage a reform of multilateralism, I believe, if we do not engage with the global South. They are too important. Their role is on the rise. So we have to engage with the global South to see with the global South how multilateralism can be reformed and what would this mean concretely. And in this respect, I believe the EU is well positioned because the EU has made significant efforts over recent years to step up its engagement with global South countries. Let me just say we had a big Africa summit last year. We have had in July a big summit meeting with Latin American countries, I think after a hiatus of more than 10 years. We have also launched an Indo-Pacific strategy 21, which covers many countries, including poorer ones. And we have just seen also the green light being given by the Council to the signing and ratification of the post-Cotonou Agreement, which is the key agreement for engaging with developing countries on issues of development and development financing, but also now in this new version of this agreement on political issues. So we have a set of instruments with which we can engage. Through which we can engage with these countries. And we do also work with some countries of the global South on issues which on dealing with the follow-up to the negative impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in particular on food security. So we want to engage, we have to engage with the global South. We have instruments. Now, I come now to a very important point. There has not yet been a reference, a bit surprisingly from my perspective, to the United Nations, because, if you look at global governance, of course, that is a key body at which we will certainly wish to look. And I find it very interesting that, the reform proposals that Secretary General Guterres has himself tabled. He has come forward with a common agenda. He wants to make multilateralism work. So he has set out a view in a document which is called the Common Agenda in 21. And there is planning ongoing for a high summit of the future in 24 at the level of heads of state and government of the United Nations member states, and also an action plan which should follow up to this. And I regret a little bit that in the public debate, there is not much attention being paid to this, because to my knowledge, this has not been cancelled, the efforts. But there is a lot ongoing, a lot is overshadowing this effort, but it is a very important effort. And I want to draw attention to this undertaking of the Secretary General of the United Nations. There has just in April been a detailed report released by a high-level panel, a high-level board with recommendations on how to make multilateralism work. This was a group of 12 people, eminent persons, a former Prime Minister of Sweden leading it together with a former President of Liberia. These proposals are on the table, and they are there to nourish the debate among United Nations member states on the future of the United Nations. And I believe there is something also for the EU and Japan to look into this. First, of course, the EU should come up with its own understanding of what it wants to do. But then in a second step, clearly the EU will need partners, and Japan is clearly an important partner in efforts to make multilateralism work and to reform multilateralism. So I believe this important United Nations effort underway has to be taken as seriously as it deserves. At the same time, I'm well aware of the risks. Tensions are running high in the world. And if President Trump would be re-elected, I'm not particularly optimistic that the chances of the UN reform would be great ultimately. Now, my two final points very briefly. I believe that the EU will certainly have to develop its own ideas on the reform of multilateralism in more detail, including, as I said, in working with partners. And finally, what matters in the end is that like-minded countries, Japan and EU member states, we represent a set of values. It's an important discussion. How do values play into what we are discussing, global governance? And it would be a very important separate topic. Suffice it here to mention that it is indeed a very important topic, and in the reform of multilateralism, it is fundamentally important that like-minded countries and forces work together, because ultimately we must be able as democratic forces to rally world opinion to build a large enough coalition to ensure that Western values remain influential in the United Nations-led multilateralism. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Reinhold, for your insight from inside the EU, and also your own personal
I'm a former
comments.
EU official, so
Yeah.
capacity.
That's great. That's great. and how you started to react, to challenge and to complement remarks from Professor BADIE and FUJIWARA. And thanks a lot for bringing the UN back in the game. I referred to it very quickly in my introduction, but it is indeed a very big part that we must address in this discussion. So I see already the Professor BADIE is boiling with a lot of comments on all of this. So you are welcome now to react to what have been said and what of the questions that have emerge, and also from the audience we had a series of good questions, and I guess about the relevance or the significance of the hard power. Maybe we have to discuss about what we mean as definition of power, military power, the nuclear, the significance of nuclear weapons, the arms race going on. It's very important right now. So how you assess the role of hard power compared to soft power or other kind of power. Also, there is a question about the BRICS, especially with in light of the latest summit and the enlargement. And do you see BRICS as kind of having the importance to be a counterweight to the G7, or can it deliver anything to the world concretely beyond kind of political signaling that already is doing? Back to the UN, I would be also interested to get Professor BADIE and FUJIWARA's views on this, especially because Japan has been for years asking for reform of the UN Security Council, and is asking for to become a permanent member of the UNSC. So how do you see the recent trend and how the UN could go ahead? Reinhold, do you also raise the question of what would be the way ahead, the way forward? Because the diagnosis now it's quite pessimistic, but how to move forward? That's a very important question on which I would like to have the reaction of our panelists. And also, Bertrand BADIE, you mentioned, you said that global governance is not working. It's because it's challenged, but by other formats, especially minilaterals and so on. But don't you think that I'm now referring to I think how a lot of Japanese experts and officials see how Asia is organized as a kind of multi-layered, system in which you can have a multilateral organization and minilaterals and bilateral relation, of course. So it might not be a kind of either-or kind of choice, but we have nonetheless we have to see how to adjust and to coordinate the different layers in this new system. So that's a lot. Let's go back to Bertrand BADIE first on all this, and now it's the discussion part, so we can be a bit more fluid in our presentation and remarks. So, Professor BADIE, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the two panelists. I was very interested by their presentation, and there are many remarks and points of discussion. I think that we can have a daily debate, and including afternoon, if you are free. But first of all, about power. I want to overcome a kind of misunderstanding, because the problem is not to know whether power is important or not. Important is not a scientific concept. I don't know what is important. Of course, hard power does exist. Of course, hard power has different components, military, economic, and so on. That's not the problem. That's not the problem. The problem, the major problem, maybe the unique problem of international relations by now, is to know whether power is working or not. Or my point is to say that we have to pull out the cotton on the ice and to accept the idea that since 1945, power has ever been defeated. Military power first has been defeated, when even economic power is not so decisive as people say. That is very important. Why was US defeated in Vietnam? Why was US defeated in Somalia? Why was US defeated in Iraq? Why was US defeated in Afghanistan? Why was USSR defeated in Afghanistan? Why was Putin, Russia defeated in Ukraine? And even in Ukraine now, in 2022 and 2023, we see that power is not working. And I think that it's time for us, especially for great powers, to set this question. But it's a forbidden question. And this is a major question. And the problem is, one of the answers to this question is to say, when I mentioned briefly, because I didn't want to deliver a 1-hour speech, I mentioned that weakness politics is more and more substituted to power politics. What does it mean? Why weakness politics was winning during the decolonization war? For a very simple reason, is the role played by social energy in international relations. If I remember I was 4 years old at the Dien Bien Phu French defeat, and people didn't understand what it happened. And that is fantastic. Why decolonized people were winners? For a very simple reason. They were backing by a social energy. And why Ukraine is defeating Russia? Because of the Ukrainian social energy. And this is a very fundamental parameter we have to take into account. And it's a way for me, first, to go to your question about nuclear power. Nuclear power is working, has ever been working, but among powers. And when you include nuclear strategy in the new international conflict in Africa or Middle East, of course, it gets meaningless. And we have also to set the question, why? It's also a way for answering the question about, and especially the very stimulating presentation of Mr. Brender, what about a positive vision of global governance? There was a very great man Kofi Annan. And Kofi Annan was the first to propose a solution. That's to say, Kofi Annan had the right intuition that first, and you are totally right, I totally agree with you, multilateralism is the only way for going to global governance. But he said that we can reach a positive and a working multilateralism only through dealing with social issues. It's what he called social multilateralism or complex multilateralism. And he said that it's the only way for surrounding the resistance, the resilience of a traditional power, the veto power, the power of the great power. And that's why I would say that the UN system, which was created in 1945, at the time when development issues, environment issues, and even health issues didn't exist, were not relevant. And if we now observe this system, which was created in 1945, we observe that there are two UN systems. It's like cholesterol. Multilateralism can be compared to cholesterol, the good cholesterol and the bad cholesterol. The bad cholesterol is the Security Council, which is not working at all. Did you hear something from Security Council about the Ukraine war? And did you hear something from the Secretary General about the Ukraine war? By the way, is there still a Secretary General in UN? Or maybe he resigned. I have not heard him about this war. This is the evidence that the political version of the UN system is there, while the social dimension of the UN system is working. And many agencies, institutes in the field of health security, of food security, and even about environment and so on, work very efficiently. And we have to strengthen this dimension. And I think that through this new dimension of a real global social governance, we will be able to reach a more efficient multilateralism. And I totally agree with Professor Fujiwara when he mentioned that the multi-level system is very efficient. It's not possible to enter a global governance without transition. And European integration, Asian integration, African integration are very good and functional transition for reaching this global governance. There is another point that is very interesting. I was fascinated by a paper written, I think it was in 2008, by the former Japanese Foreign Minister Okada and his German counterpart, Westerwelle, when he said that in a global world, we need a modest diplomacy. A modest diplomacy. What is a modest diplomacy? It's the contrary to the power diplomacy. That's to say, function is getting more important than power. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid that French diplomacy is not really a modest diplomacy. I'm afraid to say that. I'm certainly wrong, but as you mentioned, I am pessimistic. And you know, the Gabonese president said about the French diplomacy, it's a megaphone diplomacy. I'm afraid that is probably right. And we see the problem which are rising from this megaphone diplomacy now in Niger. I don't want to monopolize the time. There are many, many other points. I think that it's a kind of question more than a reply to my dear Japanese colleague. There is something fascinating in Asia. It's this contradiction between apparent political tensions between Tokyo and Beijing, and this extraordinary economic interdependence between Japan and China. And I think that is the right picture of the new world when I mention interdependence as one of the major parameters. And I think that this economic interdependence is working much more than this apparent political tension. I put an end here, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, yeah, sure. We have a bit less than 10 minutes left, but we can take a bit more, of course. But thanks a lot, Professor BADIE, for all the replies and the impassionate comments. And now, Fujiwara Sensei, what would you like to add, and how would you like to react to all of this?
I very much welcome Professor BADIE's discussion about power and its limits. When we talk about power, we can talk about domination and unilateral enforcement of decisions. If you don't say yes, you're going to be conquered. That is the logic of the empire, and that dominance model has worked in many ways, but empires cannot sustain themselves simply by dominance, even if we're talking about the Roman Empire, or for that matter, the Habsburg Empire, which was an empire, but nonetheless was not an unilateral dominance. And for that matter, the United States, with its hegemony, could only exert power when their power was accepted by lesser powers, and whether it be Europe or Japan or Brazil or South Africa. Power has to be accepted, or otherwise it doesn't work. And that is the way that we can open opportunity for multilateralism, and that is not dependent on unilateral exertion of power. That's the major argument. And yet another argument about the global south. And if I may respond to the question about the prospects of BRICS as a counterweight to G7, I am rather dubious about it if we talk about BRICS as an entity. BRICS is working on the idea of a nation-state system, where each nation has its own rules, culture, heritage, that may not agree with others. They may work together facing some intervention, but there would be very little rule that are applied to their own behavior. For that reason, I don't think BRICS is going to be a major institution. But at the same time, it does show the limit of the of institutions based on like-minded nations. The liberal international order after the end of the Cold War was open to a much wider participation, working on the wishful thinking that Russian and the Chinese would follow, the developing world would follow, but nonetheless, the idea was that the gate is always open. Today, when we talk about like-minded nations, we are really talking about a Western military alliance. And that is the major difference between a multilateral international order and a group of like-minded nation alliance. We have to break this chain. And on that, the only way is to welcome and listen to requests, demands from nations that are not Western, that are not Northern. This listening is the basis of power relations where powers can be accepted. And that is going to be a long way, but for that I would support the Foreign Minister Hayashi of the Kiichi administration, who really has been going the extra mile for this global South diplomacy. The good thing about Hayashi is that he listens to people and does not impose. Before just giving out checks, Hayashi wants participation, and that's the good thing that I can talk about him. Yet another question about economy and peace. The old argument has it that the greater the trade, the greater the likelihood of peace. A growth of trade will open path for global peace. And that is the kind of Adam Smith argument in reverse in many ways. And then there are the alarmists who argue that economy is also a zero-sum sphere. This is a struggle for dominance, a zero-sum game in economy and also in military matters rule the world. What we see in Asia is something quite different, because trade is growing between China and the world, and China and the region. And interregional trade actually in East Asia is much larger than the global trade growth. But at the same time, military tension is growing at this moment as well. What is necessary is to avoid major wars. And this is the reason I would be rather cautious in discussing about nuclear weapons, not because I want a nuclear-free world, which I do, but more importantly, nuclear weapons have not been used for 70 plus years, but there was always a possibility of being used in the battlefield. Once that weapon is used, we are escalating conflict to a tremendous degree. And on that, I think Kishida should have pushed a bit more on the nuclear agenda in Hiroshima. Talking about abolishment of nuclear weapons is not enough. We do need some more measures, like negative security assurance that nuclear powers would not attack non-nuclear powers, and no first use of nuclear weapons. If I'm not mistaken, actually, allies of the United States is more opposed to no first use principle than the United States, which, well, Mr. Biden had agreed upon before. So there would be crisis management that would be necessary if we see a growth of military tension. I should stop here. I can go on endlessly. Less than Professor BADIE, but a match, really.
Thanks a lot, Fujiwara Sensei, for all your very good insight. I'm very interested by your reflection about the power and the need to the power has to be accepted, to be seen as legitimate to be able to work indeed. I think you're right, and I need to apologize because I couldn't organize this debate in Paris. If so, we could all have continued the discussion in the restaurant for lunch. Unfortunately, but we have to stop soon. But I want to go back to Reinhold BRENDER for his final words on the.
Yeah, many thanks. I found very interesting and important what the two professors said. I agree entirely with Professor Fujiwara. Listening is really a quality in today's world, which is not as widespread as it should be. And I found also important the reference of Professor BADIE to the social dimension of governance, of global governance, which is very important. If you look, for example, at the lack of progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, we understand why the Global South is so unhappy as it is. I think it's a key challenge. The world has taken a commitment at global level, at highest levels, to realize these objectives by 2030. And we are not yet there where we have to be. And I find it entirely right that Secretary General, at least on this, he is active. He represents the UN system and the political side of it, so he cannot speak if the Security Council is not in agreement. That is, there he is constrained. But at least on the social agenda, he's pushing hard. On the Sustainable Development Goals, he wants to see progress, and I hope there will be progress. Yeah, and the final word on the economic interdependence, indeed a very important aspect. Of course, not just of the relationship between Japan and China, but also, if you look at the big countries in the region, India's most important trade partner is China, Australia's most important trade partner is China, Europe's most important trade partner is China, the United States' most important trade partner is China. So we are all in the boat of interdependence. And I'm not so pessimistic. I think interdependence can indeed have a stabilizing function, because we depend on each other and we cannot just cut the lines that do exist. I think they have a stabilizing function. Thank you.
Many thanks. I think we could go on and on with this discussion. Indeed, it's very rich, and I would like to thank our panelists today for bringing their insight and for this very lively discussion. I really hope we can reconvene sometime in person, this time to get a very long and a rich discussion again. I would like you to have a very nice day for those who are in Europe, and a very nice afternoon and night after that for those based in Asia and Japan. Thanks a lot again for this, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.